warm welcome to everyone joining us. We're so happy to see you with us today. Before we finally formally open the session, let us begin with a few house rules. First, if you haven't already changed your login title to name plus organization, you may do so now by clicking on the participants icon and choosing rename. Second, please ensure your microphone is on mute until you are selected by the moderator to participate in the discussion. Third, if you would like to contribute to the discussion, questions and comments can be raised in the chat box, or you may click on the participants icon and select Raise Hand, which will alert the moderator that you would like to make a point. Please say your name and organization after the host has unmuted your microphone. Please select Lower Hand once you have spoken and your microphone will be muted. Please keep questions short and straightforward to allow more questions from other participants. Fourth, English may be a second language for some of our participants, so we promote the use of slow, clear, and simple communication. We ask that participants and speakers avoid jargon and acronyms, be mindful of their colleagues, and practice inclusive language as much as possible. Chinese and Russian channels are available. Participants may opt for their language of preference on the interpretation icon below their screen. Fifth, in order to ensure that the event can commence on time and take place without any disruption, all participants and speakers are expected to respect the schedule. Should speakers exceed their speaking time, they can expect a prompt from the moderator or the governance forum secretariat. Finally, if you experience any technical problems, please let me or any member of the governance secretariat know, and we will do our best to attend to you. I hope you find many practical lessons and insights in this event. I now turn you over to our moderator.
Hello, everyone. I'm Xiaohong Yang. I'm the Chief Thematic Officer of ADB. I will take you through today. It is very exciting to see so many development partners, ADB colleagues, board members, and then also a lot of development government high-level staff and ministries joining today's session. So let me begin with a warm introduction of our VP, Bambang Susantono. VP is for knowledge management and sustainable development of ADB. He is first Indonesian in this position. We are very proud to announce. And he is also responsible for managing knowledge in ADB and coordinating researchers and studies on various topics such as energy, transport, education, health, finance, urban, and also cross-cutting themes like climate change, governance, gender, social development, environment, rural development, and food security, as well as regional cooperation. He also coordinates ADB's annual flagship publication. You know, these are the very big ones like Asian Development Outlook, Key Indicators of Asian Pacific, and also our famous Asian Regional Economic Integration Report. Prior to this, VP was the acting minister and vice minister of transportation of Indonesia, and also deputy minister for infrastructure and regional development at the Office of Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. He was also in charge of the member board for airline, port, telecoms, media companies. He also taught in many universities, and he holds a PhD in infrastructure planning and has 2 master's degrees in transportation engineering and city and regional planning from University of California, Berkeley. And then without further ado, everybody knows him without any introduction. Let me over to our VP for his opening remarks. Over to you, VP. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a generous introduction, Chief Xiaohong Yang. A very good day to all of you, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's Governance Forum. This year's theme is about the different ways governance can support countries to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic put the state and public institutions at the forefront of response measures. Governments had to mobilize and distribute large amounts of resources to respond to urgent needs. And in many cases, they are still doing so. Generally, they relied on existing institutions and systems, particularly health-related, fiscal, and monetary. These were key in channeling resources and money to the most vulnerable people. As a result, governance and institutional capacity assumed greater significance during the crisis. Fragilities and systemic gaps become evident, particularly as the countries move through various phases of the COVID-19 crisis, whether from relief to recovery, adopting a new normal, and then to the next normal. Major questions need to be raised about the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. They are by far the most important development commitments countries worldwide have made. Yet, there were visible signs they were slipping away in the Asia-Pacific region even before the COVID-19 outbreak. Many argue that had countries made greater progress on the SDGs, they may have been in stronger positions to respond to the pandemic. Importantly, little attention was given at the subnational or local level to achieving SDG targets. It has become clear that the 2030 agenda relies on progress made at the local level. Nonetheless, it is important to recognize that work toward attaining the SDGs continues to be held back by limited fiscal space. Often, this is due to the need for greater revenues and better ways to more efficiently allocate these scarce public resources. This is all aggravated by the urgent need to respond to the health crisis with government stimulus. Thus, despite the significant progress made on some goals, like providing quality educations, the region will likely miss targets on all 17 SDGs by 2030. We really must address these challenges to improve resource mobilizations, allocations, and use in support of the SDGs. As countries consider the need for broad institutional reform to address these vulnerabilities and systemic gaps, policymakers must also consider the importance of short and medium-term priorities to better service delivery. As I said, new normals will become next normals. This offers us at ADB the opportunity to support our clients map out and build governance pathway that can accelerate and better realize the SDGs in a post-pandemic environment. This is where 2021 ADB Governance Forum comes in. The forum hopes to introduce each of the 4 interconnected governance themes and expound on their individual intrinsic value to COVID-19 relief, recovery, and adaptation efforts, and consider how ADB can support its developing member countries to develop or reorient their governance pathway towards a pandemic-resilient economy within the context of the 4 thematic areas. These 4 themes are: first, domestic resource mobilizations; second, state-owned enterprise reform; third, quality infrastructure investment; and fourth, localizing the SDGs. We have dedicated sessions on each of these themes because these serve as the foundational pillars within the context of our ADB strategy 2030. Together, they ensure that government measures to strengthen public service delivery are holistically executed with a strong governance and capacity development lens. This lens involves 3 complementary aspects. They are: 1, well-functioning multi-level governance structures; 2, state-owned enterprises and the private sector reforms; and 3, value for money in infrastructure investment within a constrained fiscal space. Adopting this lens today in the pandemic recovery would be critical for governments as they make adjustments in their pathways toward more resilient and sustainable development. The forum also gave us an opportunity to take a step back and consider the basics of good governance that weave through the fabric of every pathway. This is the importance of accountability, participations, predictability, and transparency of any effective program. This importance cannot be ignored, especially in the midst of acute scarcity of public resources like what we have today. We also need to harness the power of digital technology to link the various stakeholders from both the supply and demand sides of governance, as this will ensure that our efforts consistently focus on citizen-centric service delivery. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let us all work together to explore how we can use more effective governance pathways to create more resilient economies in a post-pandemic Asia and the Pacific. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Xiaohong.
Thank you so much, VP, and thank you for your wonderful keynote speeches. And that fits so well for our 2021 Governance Forum. Let me warmly introduce Dr. Deep Mukherjee, and he is our professor of economics and the director Institute for Economic Development at Boston University now. So thank you for attending this at your evening time. He received his PhD from LSE way back in 1982 and has previously taught at Stanford University and the Indian Statistical Institute. And most importantly, most of his work on development economics focus on countries we have great interests, such as Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and China, on topics such as agriculture development, financial inclusion, supply chain, intermediaries, entrepreneurship, and governance. He serves on the Council of the Econometric Society and Asian Regional Standing Committee on Research Management Committees of International Growth Center and also Economic Development and Institutional Network. He's also co-author of many, many wonderful books and also the blog Ideas for India and the associate editor at the Journal of Development Economist. Without further ado, Dr. Deep, may I over you the floor? Thank you. The floor is yours. So you have 17 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and privilege to deliver the keynote lecture. Let me, without further ado, get started. Share my screen. Can you see it now? Yes.
Yes, we do.
Yes. Okay, very good. So as the COVID pandemic hopefully will come under control, developing countries face new challenges, as well as many pre-existing problems. So it is a fruitful time to reassess development policy priorities. For an organization such as the ADB, the question is which areas to focus on in the next decade. And in this lecture, I hope to suggest areas where external assistance is likely to be most beneficial, mostly based on recent academic research. So just on terms of conceptual background, investing in infrastructure requires a suitable notion of infrastructure and an understanding of the process by which effective infrastructure investments take place. So in terms of the notion of infrastructure, I think the key question today is, do we just think of physical infrastructure, or is it something wider? Does it include human capital investments or social protection mechanisms? And the recent debates in the United States between rival political parties, this is very much a live debate. Second, the process of investing in infrastructure. Ultimately, these investments will be implemented by host country governments. And the information and accountability mechanisms of governance will determine the actual investments and their effectiveness. So for external assistance agencies like the ADB, it makes sense to invest in underlying what I call governance infrastructure. And governance infrastructure enhances information support systems and accountability of local decision makers, which in turn will determine actual investments that take place. So the idea is governance infrastructure is going to affect governance, which in turn is going to affect actual policies. And I'm going to suggest specific programs in 4 different areas: agriculture, social protection, urban governance, and sustainable development. So some qualifications before I start. What follows is a wish list based mainly on recent academic research and my own personal observations. And everybody, I'm sure at this meeting, has more practical on the ground experience than I do. Moreover, my research and observations are largely based on India, the PRC, and other countries in the South Asia region. Okay, so let me start with agriculture. And the first area in agriculture that I wish to emphasize is land records, which are in an extremely poor state in many countries, such as Bangladesh and India. A work of Klaus Deininger in the World Bank and some work I have been doing with Pranab Bardhan. Specifically, the problem is that the land records exist on paper. They are organized on a plot by plot basis, and they are stored physically in land records offices. And moreover, they are based on outdated cadastral surveys, some of which took place a long time ago. For instance, in India, most of them are based on surveys carried out by the British colonial government in 1940. What is needed in a modern land record system is computerized data, which is organized not just by plot, but also by households. This is really important because one has to know how much land a particular household owns. And then moreover, these details have to be periodically updated to keep into account changes in the quality of the land because of investments that may have been carried out. Computerized records must be accurate, they must be tamper-proof, and they must be instantly accessible by multiple users. And this is so important for 2 reasons. One is the ease of access and the credibility of information promotes market efficiency and growth by reducing corruption, by reducing conflict, enhancing property rights and incentives of farmers, by activating land markets, and promoting credit access based on land collateral. It's also equally important in enhancing state capacity, in more efficient tax administration, in the targeting of social protection and anti-poverty programs. So for instance, it is very important to know the level of need of any individual household. And in societies where most of the population is still in rural areas, where land is the most important asset, one needs to know, the government needs to know how much land and what quality of land is owned by any given household. So all of this is very important in order to be able to accurately assess and value assets. So there is a very urgent need for diffusion of best practices and assistance in modernizing land records. The second topic in agriculture is R&D and extension services. I was doing a recent project trying to compare the growth of India and the PRC. And it turned out when evaluating agricultural performance, one of the most important differences between agriculture in the 2 countries is that rice yields in the PRC are at least twice as high as India. And this goes back 40 years. And this owes mainly to its successful R&D program in hybrid rice, which started in the mid-1960s. Even within different rice growing areas of the PRC, researchers have identified that the hybrid rice varieties explain about 60 to 70% of the variation in yields. Moreover, diffusion varies a lot. Diffusion of hybrid rice varieties in India has been extremely limited. Only 4% of rice area in India is under the hybrid varieties, whereas in the PRC, 50% of area is under the PRC. And this is being explained by relative cost and accessibility of complementary seeds and fertilizers. So there is an urgent need for the diffusion of best practice, as well as coordinating agricultural research across all of Asia. Let me now turn to my second topic, which is anti-poverty and social protection mechanisms. So first, let me highlight that there is clear economic argument for including mechanisms for human capital development as part of a broader notion of infrastructure. It is just as important as physical infrastructure. Growth and equity requires suitable investments in human capital by households that are vulnerable to poverty and risk. And this is illustrated by growing evidence of the importance of early childhood investments in maternal care, child nutrition, and child learning. The COVID pandemic and the key problem of contagion highlights the need for equalizing access to public health information and services to all sections of society. However, there is a key problem of the targeting of these mechanisms. Existing mechanisms in many Asian countries has been shown by recent research to be beset with what I call the 3C problems: corruption, capture, and clientelism. The key difficulty arises from the lack of a reliable information system. And so this goes back to the poor state of the land records. So in order to appropriately target resources to regions and then within regions to households, the government needs to have a reliable and up-to-date information system about need. And a recent piece of research I did in the context of West Bengal, an Indian state, we tried to calculate the improvement in targeting that would result from switching from the current discretionary system of allocating benefits through local governments to a formula-bound program. And we found that there would be almost no improvement whatsoever, essentially because the formula were based on information which was too poor. A second problem is the financial inclusion, the lack of financial inclusion of vulnerable groups. So this makes it very difficult, even if the central government were to be able to identify accurately the need of specific households, it would still need to find a way of delivering resources to them directly and not going through intermediaries. So these considerations imply that central governments have no option but to delegate distribution to bureaucrats and local government officials with limited oversight, which in turn generates the problem of the 3Cs. So recent moves towards formula-bound assistance programs, which have occurred in Indonesia, studied recently by Ben Olken and his co-authors at MIT, and Pakistan in a paper by Hasib and Viborni, show that improving the state information system can result in vast improvements in the extent of pro-poor targeting. So there is, therefore, let me summarize, a need for reliable information system regarding assets and needs of households and local areas, accompanied by the spread of financial literacy and access to mobile or bank-based direct transfers. Let me now turn to a second urgent problem, vividly illustrated by the COVID crisis. There were a very large number of migrant workers who were trapped in urban areas, who were desperate to return to their village homes. Estimates in India range from between 50 to 100 million people. And this mainly owed to lack of access to health and social protection for the migrants in the cities. This reflects, again, a big gap in identification and entitlement mechanisms, which are currently based on the principal residence of households. So since these were mostly temporary migrants, their principal residence was in the village. And so they lacked any means of identification or entitlement in the city. And this resulted in a big problem, provision of temporary shelter and transport back. And this also contributed to the spread of the disease to rural areas. From an even more long-term perspective, growth, we know in today's world, in Asia, depends on structural transformation. which means large reallocation of labor from rural to urban areas where labor is more productive. And recent research indicates that barriers to migration include non-pecuniary disincentives faced by workers and informational barriers. These non-pecuniary disincentives come from a very unsanitary and difficult circumstances of transport and finding jobs in the city. So there is an urgent need for the development of nationwide identification and social protection programs, job market information and matching with potential employers. And there is recently a proposal floated by Jean Drèze in India, a decentralized urban employment and training program called Do It. I refer you to the blog Ideas for India. If you click on Jean Drèze and Do It, you can read more about this idea. Let me now move to the third topic, urban governance. Fast rates of urbanization and industrialization in the PRC compared to India was associated with large differences in spending on urban infrastructure, over 4% of GDP in the PRC versus less than 1% in India. And this in turn related to the corresponding nature of city government, specifically differences in fiscal capacity and autonomy, a very high and increasing reliance on local taxes and extra budgetary financing mechanisms in the PRC, rather than grants from upper tiers of government. Higher levels of organizational effectiveness. Particular problem in India was arising from the multiplicity of local, state, national, and parastatal government agencies that had overlapping jurisdictions over the provision of urban infrastructure. And then leader selection and accountability. There were performance-driven selection and promotion mechanisms for city mayors in the PRC. So all these factors contributed to the fast rate of urbanization and industrialization in the PRC. However, more systematic research and policy experimentation is needed. So there is a need for research, advice, the diffusion of best practices for urban governance, specifically enhancing fiscal capacity, improving property tax assessment and collection mechanisms, designing and implementing infrastructure benefit-based charges, for instance, in the form of land auctions for developers. Land acquisition and compensation, designing mechanisms for adequate compensation to be given to owners of acquired land. And this process will benefit from improving the land records. And then enhancing organizational effectiveness, limiting the multiplicity of principles, redesigning the allocation of responsibilities. And finally, enhancing the accountability of leaders with oversight and information mechanisms, such as utility regulators, citizen councils, and citizen report cards. I turn now to my fourth final topic, sustainable development, and growing problems of pollution, environmental degradation, and climate change. Here, there is a need for enhanced control mechanisms for air and water pollution, requiring accurate pollution measurement and enforcement mechanisms, for instance, through third-party audits, as in India, or citizen complaints via social media in the PRC. Clean energy substitutes, importance of R&D, diffusion of new technologies in solar and wind energy and low carbon fuels, reforestation and watershed development in areas subject to deforestation and increased water scarcity, which requires active involvement of local communities. And here the governance aspect of it, the local governance element, is particularly important. And finally, restricting coastal damage and enhancing adaptation mechanisms, restoring coasts, reefs, and mangroves, crop and livelihood adaptation to rising seawater levels, and the resettlement of vulnerable coastal communities. So let me end. This is a long wish list based primarily on academic research and personal observations. The ADB may already have many ongoing programs in these areas, which ought to be renewed. And in areas that are not currently covered, I hope you will consider including these. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Dilip Mukherjee. And we know you have touched many important issues, both practical and difficult development challenges in agriculture, social protection, urban governance, sustainable development. So with this, I would like to open the floor for Q&As, and then the floor is open. Anybody want to come up to ask a question first? Let me see. Okay, please feel free to, okay. Dasutai, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Professor Dr. Mukherjee. I have one question for you. So if I'm not mistaken, issues pertaining to land have appeared in your presentation on several occasions. The land has become one of the key constraints for manufacturing activities in many countries, including India. On the other hand, meaningful employment opportunities cannot be created without manufacturing. So manufacturing has the largest employment elasticity. What do you propose to solve this dilemma? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dasute. Let me also ask another question myself. Doctor, and you highlighted the challenges of digital revolution and also the challenges we are having on the migrations from rural to urban. And during the COVID-19 period, ADB has been really scaling up our social protection programs. For example, in Pakistan and also in Indonesia, we were able to really promote transparency and also, accuracy in sharing our social protection benefits to the most needed people. So we found it out also that also helped us to promote a lot of social and financial inclusion program by enrolling a lot of people with actually wallet account. So that was very involving. So we'd like to really consult you how we can further scale up those social protection programs in the region. So over to you before we collect more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. That's okay. Yes, absolutely right. That's why I stress the importance of structural transformation, the fact that productivity of workers is much higher in manufacturing. So we have to ensure ways in which workers can migrate and find decent jobs in the city. We need to remove barriers to migration. And this is where social protection for migrants is going to be important. This is where reforms in urban governance are going to be very important. So I think urban city governments have to modernize their fiscal capacity, their organizational effectiveness, enhanced accountability. So all of those mechanisms were going to not only provide greater social justice and welfare to the needy, it will at the same time enhance growth by promoting this kind of transition from agriculture to industry. The importance of, let's say, accurate land records is important because the process of transfer from agriculture to industry also involves the transfer of land, which requires the process of land to be acquired and for farmers to be justly compensated for the value of their land, for which again, very accurate records of land owned by households is important. And my research on some of the problems that were faced with land acquisition in India were related again to problems with the land records, where the government was not aware of the quality of the land. So a lot of people whose land had been acquired were undercompensated because of the undervaluation of quality of their land by the government. It was not due to any intentional undercompensation. It was just because of the poor land records. So turning now to Xiaohong's question about social protection, it's very good to hear that the ADB has been focusing on this area in Pakistan and Indonesia, providing access through wallet accounts and ways of transferring money is extremely important. But as we've learned in times of COVID, that is not enough. I think there has to be equal emphasis on public health, the spread of information and access to public health. And that kind of access has to be nationwide. It has to move from households to individuals. So it is a very challenging task, I think, in terms of updating information systems. First, to go to accurate information about households, but then you have to go beyond households to individuals. Because these days, households in rural areas, a significant number of people in the household are away on temporary work somewhere else. And so in some sense, the locus has to move to individuals as they move around looking for jobs in the city.
Thank you so much, Dr. Didip. You are absolutely right. We are now working on stage 2 project to see how the social protection can also link to both health and education. I think DG Eugene now is working in those countries, and also Southeast, our Southeast region also working in both Philippines and also Indonesia to see how we can link them with other social development challenges we have. On the land issue, we do have some successful examples in the past, and then we are now very keen to work at the local level, not at the central level only, to tackle both the urban and also rural challenges, especially the urban governance and rural governance challenges. So with this, I'm asking and checking whether there's some other okay, let me see another. There's one question here from Shamit. Thank you for raising several important issues in your presentation. 2 quick questions. Why are land records not being updated in India? Is it because of opposition from political parties and powerful lobbyists? This question touches about the political economy. Or will this process require huge amount of resources, etc., which deters state government? Second, okay, there is this Aadhaar linked direct benefits transfers. I think that's a fundamental digital mechanism in India linked to Gen Khan account and mobile phones. It's truly transformational. Can this somehow be used to tackle the problem of poor data on household and land holding, etc.? Thank you. Over to you. That's a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so these are very perceptive questions. Why are land records not being updated in India? Yes, I think it's partly because of some opposition by vested interests. In my research, I was surprised to find that quite often land that had been surplus land that had been appropriated by local governments had not been distributed to the poor, which is which was the purpose of appropriating the excess land. And then when I inquired as to the magnitude and what was happening to that land, I found that it was being rented by local leaders of the local government and who are earning rents from it. And also they hold out the promise of giving somebody a land title and then being able to extract favors from them, or it's a means of developing a clientelistic relationship. So there are sort of politically some vested interests, but that's not the only reason. It does require a huge amount of resources. It does, because in fact, there was a program of computerization of land records in some states, but then when I checked the computerized records were not at all, they had not been properly verified. The process of verification requires going beyond paper records, and it requires a judicial process by which people have to come forward. And sometimes there is a lot of dispute about who actually owns a piece of land. Those disputes have to be resolved. So it involves problems both on the judicial and the legal side, as well as the resources involved in this exercise. So it is quite a forbidding task, but it can be done. And I think with the assistance of international agencies, I'm sure it can be achieved if there is enough political will. Regarding Aadhaar linking, yes, Aadhaar does provide huge promise, but there have been some restrictions imposed by the Supreme Court of India on, there are some concerns about security and some restrictions on being able to link Aadhaar with other information. So I think it still remains to be seen. I think there is great promise there, but these legal and judicial barriers will also have to be overcome. Besides, Aadhaar has been extended to a very large part of the country, but there are still 7 to 8% of the population, very vulnerable groups for whom the coverage is incomplete. There are errors in the use of Aadhaar. There was a recent effort to create to link the food distribution system with Aadhaar, and because of mistakes in that system, there were some very unfortunate omissions. Some young children died. So it is, I think there are still a lot of problems to be faced in the transition. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful answer. We do know the process of verification in the land record, not just India, but other countries well. It's really, really cumbersome. And multiple owners claim one same plot of land. And also the Aadhaar still has a long way to go, but there are huge progress achieved. So a lot of countries are learning the Aadhaar experience. So with this, I think let's close this session 1. Let's have a group happy photo. If I over to our admin side, who is over there, Hiranya and the team, could you make sure to capture a smiling photo because so many DGs here. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. We hope we can have more conversation with you and work on this very important area. Yeah.
Ali, you can take it over. Ali, please initiate this photograph, group photo. Everyone should put their camera on.
Okay, may we ask all the participants to put their cameras on? May I ask Zoe and the events management team to please support taking of the photos?
Okay, just waiting for everyone to turn on their photos. Okay, just look directly on the camera, please. Okay, taking the photo now. Okay. Okay. Taking the photo now in 1, 2, 3. Okay. All good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doctor, and everyone. Should we go straight to session 1 or we have a break? Let me ask Arnie.
We will now go straight to session 1.
Okay. Over to you, Hiranya. So you were chair, right?
Yes. Now,
okay, great.
Ali will step in. Ali, please explain, do your usual role.
Thank you everyone again for joining us for the launch of the event. For those who are just joining us now, I'll just run through these house rules very, very quickly. Please use your name and organization, have that specified in your name. Please utilize the chat function if you have any questions, or you may raise your hand to do so. We may now go to the interpretation page. As you know, English may be a second language for some of our participants, so we promote the use of slow, clear, and simple communication. We ask that speakers and participants avoid jargons and acronyms and be mindful of their colleagues and practice inclusive language as much as possible. Chinese and Russian channels are available. Participants may opt for their language of preference by clicking on the interpretation icon below their screen. This is all, and I now turn over to Hiranya, our moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. Greetings to everyone. And depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm also pleased to welcome our developing member countries, partners, including developing partners, including the IMF, OECD, World Bank, and ADB staff to share their knowledge and experience on quality infrastructure governance. Asia and the Pacific faces many challenges, including rapid urbanization, infrastructure gaps, increasing debt, climate change, and disaster risk, and aging societies. COVID-19 compounded these challenges, as we all know, and it shows just how fragile the old normal was. It is in this context the quality of infrastructure governance is crucial to build accessible, inclusive, resilient, and efficient infrastructure to achieve the sustainable development goals. Our VP has repeatedly focused emphasis on meeting the sustainable development goals. Good infrastructure governance is an enabler that directly affects the efficiency of investment and results in the greatest social and economic benefits to society for each unit of investment. It is my pleasure to welcome our Director Generals, Ms. Teresa Kho from the East Asia Regional Department, Ms. Leah C. Gutierrez from the Pacific Regional Department, Mr. Eugene Zhukov from the Central and West Asia Regional Department, and of course, Mr. Bruno Carrasco from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Let me now ask my DG, Mr. Bruno Carrasco, to commence by framing the session based on a recently published ADB Special Report entitled Quality Infrastructure in Developing Asia. Over to you, Bruno, for your presentation. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Hiranya, and I'm delighted to join you on this session 1 on quality of infrastructure governance. The work that I'm going to present is drawing from a publication earlier this year with my co-authors Hanif Rahimtullah and David Gloomgarden. Next slide, please. So to frame this first session, we see across Asia Pacific very important development challenges that we still face, and that includes such things as what you see in Figure 1, 300 million people without access to improved drinking water, 350 million people without access to electricity, 1 billion people living more than 2 kilometers from an all-seasoned road, and 1.5 billion people that lack improved sanitation facilities. More recently, the impact of COVID-19 has set us back, as we've seen with the VP's opening remarks on the SDGs. And we know, for example, that in terms of a very important indicator, poverty alleviation, we've seen some 78 million people who have now fallen below the poverty lines as a result of the contraction in many economies facing the ravages of COVID-19. In addition, we have in Figure 2 another crisis, a looming crisis at that, and that is the climate change crisis. Many developing countries still see very much climate change as a legacy issue, but the fact of the matter, as we see on this chart, is that increasingly developing economies are also contributing. And in the case of developing Asia, it currently accounts for approximately 60% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. What do these challenges have in common? Well, in large part, it has to do with improving service delivery and improving the infrastructure which supports the service delivery. Next slide, please. So in this figure, we basically see the limited fiscal space that is increasingly dire, increasingly left very much in the open in terms of how countries can address improvements in service delivery through infrastructure investment. We've seen over the course of the pandemic that countries have indeed used their fiscal stimulus, their monetary stimulus, as was required to try to undertake a fiscal smoothing, trying to address some of the challenges in terms of the shocks. And we've seen that strong stimulus throughout 2000. 2001, we're starting to see a little bit more of removing of that stimulus. And by 2022, we expect to see some fiscal contraction as the economies start recovering. This is going to underscore the importance of improvements in public expenditure management and strengthening, of course, of domestic resource mobilization. If we look at some of the figures that have been presented in terms of addressing some of the challenges in terms of maintaining growth momentum, responding to climate change, and meeting the SDG targets, you have on the right side of the screen some increasingly large quantities of funding required to support those challenges and address those challenges. Next slide, please. Okay, so in figure 4, what we're seeing now is that the shape of the recovery across Asia Pacific and more worldwide is going to be largely driven by how quickly countries are able to address the COVID-19 challenge, how quickly they're able to bring the infection rates under control, and eventually, if not bring down the incidence of COVID-19 significantly, if not to at least try to bring it sufficiently so that we can see greater prospects for recovery, bringing people back to work, being able to take on and open up new activities that were very much held back, including tourism, including transport. And what we're seeing is that there is a large supply constraint in terms of access to vaccines, particularly across developing economies. But what we've seen also is that those economies that have gotten a stronger control on the COVID-19 pandemic, been able to make improvements and through vaccinations reduce those incidents. We're seeing those economies likely to recover stronger. So here we have a sample of some countries. It looks right now that some of the Southeast Asian economies will be coming out with a little bit more of a lag, a little slower than what we're seeing in some of the East Asian economies. I wanted also to mention VP has spoken very, very clearly on the importance of sustainable development goals as part of addressing some of the development challenges. For those of you who have photographic memory, I have a 2019 figure. VP showed the most recent, just released 2020 figures. You will see how we have moved back from 2019 to 2020, and we're still further away from meeting the 2030 17 SDG targets. Next slide, please. So let's drill now into QII, quality infrastructure investment, and let's try to deconstruct it. What does it really mean? What is it all about? Well, in a very simple way, QII is really about enhancing value for money of infrastructure investments. And this can be most easily seen across 3 metrics that we presented here. The first one is efficiency. And we draw here on an IMF study entitled Well Spent that looked at the public investment management assessments across countries. And they came out with a very startling figure that across emerging market economies and straight through to low-income developing countries, there are inefficiencies in the range of 30 to 50% on infrastructure investment. And that compares against a full efficiency deviation. So clearly, if we're going to create value for money in terms of our infrastructure investments, we need to make sure that those investments are efficient. And I'll turn back to that later on. A second metric is accessibility. And accessibility can mean outreach to far areas in the country, but it also can refer to the affordability of infrastructure services, services in total. We did some joint work with Thinking Machines in the Philippines, and we tried to break down a little bit what the wealth index looks like across the country, broken down through barangays. and contrast that to access to internet, in particular broadband speed. And as you can see, large parts of the country still have limited access to fast broadband speed. In fact, it's mostly in the greater Manila area, central Luzon, and a little bit of Cebu, where we have that light color that suggests high wealth index and high broadband speed. If you think of the social implications of infrastructure and services, education, Philippines is a country where schools have been physically closed for over 1.5 years now. Think of the implications in terms of students who have no access to that internet speed to be able to carry on their studies. Turning to a third metric, we refer to sustainability or resilience in this case. This is a picture of a road in northeastern Vietnam, which has been built on an elevated platform, as you can see, to be able to withstand up to a 1 in 20-year extreme weather event. So this is, again, showcasing the importance of climate change and how we need to build in a way that addresses and tries to mitigate, if not adapt to those changes in the weather pattern. We also look at sustainability from more of a public finance perspective and making sure that we are able to build within the context of sustainable debt positions. Next slide, please. I want to touch a little bit, but I won't go too far into it on governance challenges in developing Asia. So by and large, there's a lot of work that has been done at the World Bank and other institutions on what we refer to as the worldwide governance indicators. And this is the idea of bringing together from perception surveys important aspects of governance. And what we do know is that good governance largely helps in terms of improved development outcomes. We've seen in this chart here how developing countries are still far away from the better performance highlighted here across the OECD countries, the cobweb on the further outside on the yellow axis. And what we have seen is that there have been improvements across developing Asia in terms of government effectiveness, in terms of regulatory quality. Of course, there are some considerations such as voice and accountability that still lag. And what we have seen over the recent years is that Asia Pacific has now overtaken Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of the governance indicators. Next slide, please. All right, so it's important to put into context the critical role that infrastructure investment has in terms of the sustainable economic recovery. We've seen again the importance of government spending as a counter-cyclical measure in the context of the current downturn. And taking from figure 11, we have seen over the years the importance of gross fixed capital formation spending in terms of driving greater GDP growth. Here we have a set of countries where we can see clearly those countries that had fairly robust increases in government GCFC spending, largely leading to important gains in terms of higher GDP growth over the 2009-2014 period, the post-global financial crisis. And again, it underscores the importance of being able to address, in the context of certainly Asia Pacific, a lot of the infrastructure gaps that will have very strong spillover multiplier effects if this infrastructure investment is done right, in line with those quality infrastructure investment principles that we've seen, or we will see, and those 3 metrics that we've seen. I won't go into figure 12, so let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what we've seen in terms of some of the recent results in terms of how do we invest more appropriately, how do we select investment projects that can give us, shall we say, a bigger bang for the buck. And here we refer to a very interesting article that came out last year, and it shows that we need to be selective and we need to choose carefully in how we invest in infrastructure projects. In figure 13, we have a presentation that looks at 3 considerations of infrastructure investment. One is the potential climate impact on the y-axis. The other is the more traditional long-run multiplier indicator from that investment. And then in terms of the color coding, you have the third consideration, which is how quickly is the impact felt. And what we see from these results is that you have a lot of interesting combinations in the northeast quadrant that are very important to bear in mind. We have, for example, T, which represents the investments in clean energy infrastructure. And then we have L, X, and Y, which are really investments that are driven into the knowledge economy and through research and development. The impact on speed, of course, is slightly different, and you see the colored circles in their K and D as the larger ones in terms of the faster speed. Turning to figure 14, and then this again is linked in some ways to the results that we were looking at earlier in terms of the efficiency of public investment. Again, this is a work undertaken by IMF and PIMA exercise, and what we see is that there is somewhat of a divide between the institutional scores across important areas of project management and the effectiveness scores. So the institutional scores are in some ways what we have on paper, what we have on design, and then we have what effectively is translated when we put those designs into implementation mode. So we see, for example, the greatest divergences between the blue and the red could be in such things as number 4, project appraisal. It could be in such areas as maintenance funding, number 9, project selection, selectivity criteria, item 10, as well as other important matters, including the monitoring of public assets. Next slide, please. So what we try to do in this slide is we try to bring all of this together. So we need to have more efficient public investment. We need to make sure that there is accessibility to these investments in terms of service delivery, and we need to make sure that they're resilient and they're sustainable. To get that, we really need to go back to our project management and project cycle approach, and we need to make sure that we're able to address, particularly, I would say, many of those gaps that I just presented in the earlier slide in terms of the differences between institutional and effectiveness. So we have to be much better at screening and selecting and identifying projects. The appraisal of projects needs to be done much better. Procurement and project management, we have to be able to monitor those projects. And if we do this, and if we integrate that with the QII principles that I have below, including maximizing sustainability and growth, life cycle costs and value for money, environmental considerations, resilience to natural disasters, social considerations, infrastructure governance. If we do that right, we should be able to create that enhanced value for money that we're referring to under the quality infrastructure investments. I want to mention very clearly now, given the pandemic, given the importance of the recovery, given the importance of the need to invest carefully, is when this whole agenda on QII really makes a difference. Turning to figure 16, ADB operates within a QII framework. We have not labeled it like that in the past, but we have what we refer to as our instruments or filters. And these can include some of what you see on the slide: safeguard policy statements to make sure that we are in compliance with environmental considerations. We're in compliance with resettlement policies and with indigenous people policies. We look at such things as the economic and impact assessment of our projects. We have a gender operational plan that we need to adopt and implement in our projects. We need to look at such things as the procurement, as I mentioned earlier, governance and anti-corruption action plans, corporate results frameworks, and the SPR/SSS. This is how, in some ways, we build and make sure that those projects that we invest in can ensure the highest degree of quality and accessibility. This is what we need DMCs to be focusing more and more in terms of their own approach to investment, infrastructure investment. Next slide, please. Okay, if we turn to a modality of procurement options that also supports strongly infrastructure investments, we need to say a little bit about PPP projects. So here we've seen, as you can note from the chart on the right-hand side, figure 17, that over the last few years, in particular from 2012 onwards, we have seen a declining trend in both the value and the volume of PPP projects, and this is across emerging markets and developing economies. What do the surveys suggest? Well, it depends who you ask. So if you ask the private sector side, they feel that they are ending up assuming much more risks than what they perhaps thought they would, recognizing that the government and public sector has greater tolerance for risk. From the government side, we're seeing that the government feels that there's not enough value for money in terms of the PP projects that are being invested in. So this is very important to consider. And again, it brings back the importance of making sure that we have strong upstream investments in the whole legal regulatory framework, taking it through to the midstream investment side and making sure that the investments are very much lined up with the public investment management plans, feeding them into the medium-term fiscal frameworks. And if we do that right, then downstream, we should be having better quality projects that we can support. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, what I wanted to raise is the fact that, again, we need to be very selective in how we choose our PPP projects. And if we do so, and if we take into account the earlier point about making sure that the PPP infrastructure investments are part of a larger feedback loop that I will come to, we can do better in terms of not just ensuring, but also monitoring and reporting on value for money assessments as compared to more of the traditional investment projects. This is something that, of course, our IED picked up in the evaluation of PPP projects, and it's something that the teams are now working on towards the new directional guidance on PPPs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted just to spend a minute or two on this slide. This presents in some ways the PPP operational framework that was in place from 2012 through to last year. And I think that it brings home the point that we need to look at investments through PPPs as part of either a pillar strategy or an upstream downstream strategy. And the whole idea is that we need to make sure that we have built enough of a feedback loop between the project financing, the downstream side, with the upstream work in terms of developing legal regulatory frameworks, supporting institutional capacity. And if we do that right, we should be able to get much better quality of projects downstream. Next slide, please. Okay, turning to my second to last slide, I believe it is. How do we marry this whole discussion in terms of quality infrastructure investments, recognizing the development challenges and the climate finance challenge that we face? So here is an assessment framework that brings home the point that we no longer can look at development challenges separately. It's not a binary. Do we invest in roads or do we invest in climate change? We have to be in some ways better able to select projects that can address both the low carbon development challenge and the climate and disaster resilience challenge within the context of service delivery. So this is a simple framework that it leads to a better decision making in terms of selectivity through the yellow, red, and green boxes that you see, and the impacts of various different decisions in terms of how we invest. It is an important framework that I think we need to be using more and more to be able to address some of these challenges given the resource constraints. Next slide, please. Okay, so in conclusion, what are the key messages? We obviously need to adapt one ADB approach. As we've seen through those filters, we involve many parts of the bank to build improved quality infrastructure projects. We need to recognize that there are greater and greater complexities in the development challenge, and we need to cut across sectors, break those silos, and integrate more the thematic considerations into those projects. We need to make sure that we're working upstream, particularly in terms of the CPF CPS, the country partnership strategies, and we need to build on the idea that knowledge can help us identify better those challenges and how do we address those challenges. Infrastructure governance is a common theme that brings that home. We need to make sure in that context that we keep in mind the importance of this feedback loop upstream, midstream, downstream. If we do that, if we support with sufficient capacity development many of these institutions that are required, then I think we can be very comfortable that our countries will be able to develop better quality projects and increase the value for money principle that we have highlighted throughout this. With that, I think I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for the very comprehensive presentation. We now move to this panel discussions phase. So I'd like to request first our DG, Ms. Leah Gutierrez, to comment on your presentation. Leah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hiranya, and thank you very much, Bruno, for the very comprehensive presentation on quality infrastructure. Just a few points from my end. Indeed, the needed infrastructure of many of our countries, including in my own group of members, the Pacific, the needed infrastructure will be a Kickstarter for us to recover from the pandemic. And as we think about the recovery from this COVID-19 pandemic, we should be looking at green, resilient, inclusive recovery. And so on the role of the infrastructure itself, indeed, we have to follow it would be good for us to be really aligned and following the principles of quality infrastructure. And as we think about that, we have to think widely on how we can actually implement this, not only for ourselves, but help support our members in implementing. So, as you did say, the quality infrastructure includes three basic principles, and those include access, sustainability, and efficiency. And we do have to think widely, and we have to think about capacity building. And capacity building here starts not just capacity building will include even from the planning stage, prioritization of investments, and then we have to think about the implementation capacities that actually include not just government systems, but also taking into consideration the roles of communities, taking into consideration the roles of the private sector. And then, of course, we have to think about asset management, and this encompasses operations and maintenance. And so this goes back again also to financing, ensuring that there is sufficient financing to undertake operations and maintenance. And here there's a very big role again of the tax revenues of domestic resource mobilization, and then also of how we can actually also at the very beginning think about the designs of projects, of investments that can actually be more sustained, that really are value for money. And as you did say, the role of PPPs, of public-private partnerships, will be very important. At the same time, I must say, in several of our member countries, state-owned enterprises still have a big role to play in quality infrastructure and social service delivery. And so we also need to work further with SOEs to ensure that they have a better performance, more efficient, so that they can be more efficient and more effective. I will stop here and hand it over to Hiranya. Thank you very much, Hiranya.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very focused comment. Now I turn to our DG from the East Asia Regional Department Scope for her comments on Bruno's presentation. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to Bruno and to you for chairing this session, but also to Bruno for making an insightful presentation. We really think the aspects that were raised by Bruno are very relevant to our operation. And I want to share some concrete examples on how we are actually attempting to assist governments in quality infrastructure. And I will focus on three things. One is on the one ADB approach that we feel is very important. The second point is on long-term programmatic approaches in our approach to ensuring developing and sustaining infrastructure. And the third one is on the use of high-level technology to actually enable us to increase or help support the sustainability of operation and maintenance of investments. So let me first tackle the one ADB approach by an example. So we have been working with SDCC, PSOD, and our department when we developed the Shenzhen climate water resilient and smart water infrastructure project, where we provided 200 million in September of 2020. In this project, what we did was we actually drew from the international experience of SDCC, the transaction structuring experience of PSOD, and our experience in the sector to drive going from a concept of actually adapting to climate change by using sponge city concepts in the project. And what we did was we entered into a one ADB approach in developing this, starting with our involvement in a TA on climate change adaptation. And then we moved from there to joining SDCC in the Asia Water Forum, and then to a roundtable on financing for water with PSOD. And when we set out to develop this, we truly drew on the knowledge of all parties concerned to drive what I would say is a more sustainable approach in addressing climate change, but also looking at the participation of private sector in the solution. And with that, combining our knowledge in the sector with credit monitoring and implementation of a private sector operations department, that enabled us to produce hopefully a more sustainable investment. On long-term programmatic approaches, I wanted to share that we actually look at a series of interventions where we come in and do knowledge, then we follow it with capacity building, and then we go in and make the investment in infrastructure, drawing on the cumulative knowledge that we've built in a specific sector, for instance. But then looking at sustainability and looking at our TA instrument. In this instance, what we did was we actually partnered with SDCC in the governance secretariat in a TA that could be supporting other departments as well, looking at value for money and fiscal life cycle costs in infrastructure procurement and PPP infrastructure procurement. We also recognize the importance of building capacity through training government officials, but also developing and sharing good practices on sustainable infrastructure life cycle management. And then recognizing that there is the importance of ensuring that government capacity is present in terms of conceptualizing, developing, procuring, contracting, implementing and monitoring infrastructure projects. We believe that these are necessary ingredients to drive sustainability. Last but not the least, I just wanted to make a comment on high-level technology. So in the case of China, we had the opportunity to provide financing in one of our projects called the Henan Dengzhou project, where we were able to introduce digital asset inventory systems for us to be able to see and for the executing agency to be able to maintain records of services their assets. This project also had an automated water leak detection system through pressure transducers, which was also another high-level technology application that we introduced in this project. We also had an automated customer service system for taking in customer calls from mobile devices. So these elements of digitization, we believe, also helps us in terms of being able to drive sustainability and operation and maintenance of the asset. So let me stop here and turn it over to you, Hiranya. Thank you.
Thank you very much for DG Co for your very practical and operationally relevant comments. I now turn to DG Eugene Zhukov for his comments on Bruno's presentation. Over to you, DG Zhukov.
Okay, thank you, Hiranya. I'd like to join Lei and Teresa for congratulating SDCC and the authors of this very important report. And we believe it covers the key reform area fronts in infrastructure governance that the region must do better on. It also lists the ways in which ADB has to approach the various infrastructure reforms and investment financing challenges of our developing member countries. So in Central West Asia, we take these points quite seriously. And I was glad to see that the crucial points were spelled out very clearly in the presentation by Bruno just a while ago. While going through the 9 recommendations in the report itself, as they're presented in the executive summary, it is important that we all do some checking on the degree to which we meet these expectations in our own operations in the different developing member countries today. Of course, every developing member country is at a different stage of institutional maturity and development, and that requires a fair degree of adaptation in the approaches and the technical recommendations of our teams. So this is perhaps something we can discuss in more specific terms later on. But it does seem like a good introspective exercise to do for each regional department. For example, in general, in terms of the first recommendation, the one for adopting the 1 ADB approach to quality infrastructure, we of course fully support it. We regularly work with our colleagues from SDCC Governance Thematic Group on both fiscal risk management and public investment management, which of course include the Ppp legal and regulatory systems to ensure the governance and efficiency outcomes in our member countries, public investment selection and prioritization decisions. Similarly, we also regularly work with our colleagues from our procurement office whenever we get traction in supporting reforms to countries' procurement governance. Examples of this happen as we speak now. In this way, we have very specifically in mind what Bruno presented in his slide 5. We do already ensure to maximize 1 ADB opportunities to promote the quality infrastructure investment principles and enhance the drivers of efficiency and sustainability of public infrastructure decisions in our member countries. Two other critical recommendations of the report. Recommendation 4 was for us to embrace programmatic approaches to infrastructure governance at national and subnational levels. And recommendation number 5 for the upstreaming and midstream support to improve infrastructure governance in our developing countries. This connects quite well, which was conveyed to us just now by Bruno in his slide 10. So this needs for us to support our developing member countries in their quest for systematic and more effective ways to go about infrastructure prioritization development and for more sophisticated forms of procurement like PPPs. It's something that we as WRD have often approached through sequenced medium-term reform assistance program. And often we have done it through our so-called policy-based loans and associated TAs to precisely establish the key preconditions that slide 10 illustrated, and in a manner that acknowledges existing risk management capabilities and constraints of each developing member country. And we believe this requires an application of well-defined mix of technical capabilities. And this is another reason why such programmatic approach is so important. So let me stop here, Hiranya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG Zhukov. Again, a set of very practical very practical comments. Now, I have some issues and questions for all the DGs. I don't know, given the time permits, how well we could do, but let me start with Mr. Carrasco, DG SDCC, followed by CWRD, then EARD, then last PARD, Pacific Department. So Bruno, first, let me ask you one particular question. You have talked about the importance of linking both upstream and midstream infrastructure work to downstream project development and financing. How can ADB do more to ensure this feedback loop is effective? Bruno, you have to unmute.
Okay, thank you very much, Hiranya. I apologize for that. I wanted to begin by thanking the three DGs, Leah, Teresa, and Eugene, for very good comments. Indeed, the implementation side is a very important consideration. The capacity constraints there. I also wanted to acknowledge the importance of service delivery and SOEs in that role that Leah mentioned. The importance of bringing in the one ADB approach, digital solutions that Teresa mentioned, and the programmatic approach that I think all of you referred to. Going to your specific question, Hiranya, I would say that when we look at the importance of linking upstream and midstream, I think it's really the linkage, first of all, across thematic and operational areas. As you know, we have the 7 operational priorities at the bank, and this is the backbone for one ADB approach. As I mentioned, upstream begins really at the CPS stage level or even pre-CPS level when we're identifying some of those challenges, and that's where I think the knowledge management action plans come in to look at some of the considerations, including on the infrastructure governance side. I think that what is important is that we have the feedback loops, the government and the CPS teams working together to identify what we need to do in terms of better enhancing the quality of that infrastructure, and then making sure that it's delivered through the country programs, and making sure again that there is that feedback loop. This is something that again I'd like to stress. Often at times it's disjointed, it's disconnected, because that information flow downstream is not coming back up to the upstream to do some self-correction. Finally, I think that such things as the medium-term fiscal framework, the whole recognition of the risks that come into many of the projects, that needs to be looked at very carefully, and we need to be able to work across departments and have a whole of government approach in infrastructure development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. My next question is for DG Zhukov. How will ADB employ the one ADB approach, in your opinion, in this region to provide high quality, honest broker policy advice and introduce global best practices to promote improved infrastructure governance?
Okay, thank you, Hiranya, for this question. I think as we go forward with post-COVID recovery, we definitely will continue to support the challenges being faced by our member countries in terms of the infrastructure development and infrastructure governance in ways that are hopefully more systematic and that do not compromise on our constant quest to remain a both reliable and credible partner for our member countries. Often this will require, as it happened also in the past, that while engaging in short-term discussions about a particular infrastructure projects, we also emphasize overall risks or any negative aspects of transaction-focused discussions. And we always emphasize the institutional requirements for the overall sustainability of government-specific project investment decisions. As it happened in the past, whenever we had to be explicit about why certain specific infrastructure finance request could not be met by us, or whenever a certain specific infrastructure project simply should not be pursued by the government. For example, because of the financial viability was an issue, or the country did not have necessary capacity to bear the implied risks. We will surely continue to undertake such sometimes tough and uncomfortable discussions with a clear medium-term vision in mind, i.e. to continue being perceived by our member countries as an honest broker, development partner that is very well aware of what is the ultimate objective of our interventions. This probably it will be easier to achieve if we actually implement what is called for in the recommendation 2 of this report, which we're discussing today, which is for us to embed infrastructure governance concerns in our own country partnership strategy discussion processes. In a way, and I quote from the report, brings in infrastructure governance in an integrated fashion where authorities plan, procure, deliver, fund, and finance long-term fiscally sustainable infrastructure, unquote. It does seem that if infrastructure development challenges of our developing member country are approached in a more systematic fashion at the CPS or country partnership level first, then it becomes easier for us to put on the table the different ways that we can support countries in a way that also fully acknowledges ahead of time the conditions under such responses can be made available. So it also comes to mind that on this particular issue that recommendations from our own independent evaluation department often also guide our way forward. For example, the last ADB report on ADB's Ppp work flagged a number of related issues in which we, ADB, must do better. Let me stop here, Karen.
Thank you, DG Zhukov, for your very useful comments. Now, my next question is for DG Co, East Asia Regional Department. My question is to you: how is ADB using knowledge initiatives to positively shape infrastructure operations and support innovations?
Thank you, Hiranya. Knowledge really should be at the very core of our operation, because to drive, I would say, a programmatic approach, we need to combine our sector knowledge with our capabilities in infrastructure investment to drive and to drive sustainability by promoting approaches to operation and maintenance during implementation. So for me, knowledge should be at the very core. And in fact, we use in our case in East Asia Department, we use our knowledge support technical assistance to actually study approaches, whether they pertain to governance or they pertain to infrastructure lifecycle management. We have to drive it from the very beginning. I want to share an example with you. For instance, when we were looking at one of our green development funds, the Shandong Green Development Fund, we actually started with a TA, a technical assistance that produced the work on catalyzing green finance. And from there, we piloted the approaches that were generated from the creation of that knowledge product to then pilot in Shandong, a green development fund. And then combining that with knowledge of the GCF, the Green Climate Fund Investment Framework, for some project selection of green projects, we found that the combination of knowledge drove investment in a more systematic and, I would say, targeted manner. And without this, I think without knowledge, that would not be possible. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, DG Ko. My next question is to DG Gutierrez, Pacific Regional Department. My question is to you. ADB recently announced a new strategy entitled ADB's Pacific Approach 2021-2025. How does this strategy implement infrastructure governance reforms to reorient economies towards a more resilient future? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Hiranya, for your question. The overarching goal of ADB's Pacific approach for 2021-2025 is to support a resilient Pacific. And this actually rests on 3 pillars. This is to prepare for and respond to shocks, deliver sustainable services, and third, to support inclusive growth. In particular, the objective of delivering sustainable services is a direct response to a core challenge of continuing weaknesses in service delivery across the Pacific. Weak service delivery stems from wide remaining infrastructure gaps, along with capacity constraints in managing and maintaining existing assets. which ultimately lead to low and unequal access to essential services. Now, in addressing the remaining infrastructure gaps, we remain committed to adhering to the G20 principles for quality infrastructure. And our investments are focused on supporting sustainable energy, connectivity, and livable cities with access to safe water and sanitation. Further, under this specific approach, we are helping our Pacific members overcome a long-standing pattern that's called build, neglect, and rebuild pattern. And we are doing this by providing long-term sector support that covers infrastructure planning, financing, and building local capacity for sustainable management and maintenance of assets. This is being facilitated by our work, by our continuing commitment to reform state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. In the Pacific region, SOEs remain as the primary service providers, but typically they are underperforming commercially, usually relying on government subsidies or equity injections. This directly contributes to inadequate provisioning of operations and maintenance costs, and which of course, with under-provisioning, it results in a rapid deterioration of assets and poor service quality. So we are supporting efforts to improve corporate governance to upgrade technical and commercial performance, while restructuring tariffs towards full cost recovery, which are essential for better service quality and reduced need for subsidies. Support for SOE reforms will be of particular importance to building resilience and maintaining state resources during this pandemic period and also after, as utilities may be facing new commercial constraints with reduced demand for services. As Bruno mentioned, PPPs in the Pacific, we are also helping utilities harness PPPs towards increasing private investments and accessing new technologies, particularly in clean energy. Thank you, Rania. Over to you.
Thank you, DG. Very happy to hear that you're focused on SOE reforms. And you know, our next session is on SOE reforms, and we have one colleagues from the Pacific Department. I think we have time for another round of questions and comments, because I have to leave some time for the questions and answer sessions for the participants. But again, I'll start with Bruno, Mr. Carrasco, and then followed by Pacific, then East Asia, and Central and West Asia Regional Department. So my question to you, DG Carrasco, is that you stressed in your presentation green and inclusive infrastructure along with improved public investment management. Many countries do not have the capacity to analyze, measure, and cost out climate-related expenditures. How can the ADB help build this capacity?
Thank you very much, Hiranya, for that question. I think when we look at the recovery, we need to, as I said, integrate aspects of development, traditional development, service delivery with the climate change agenda and moving towards completion of the Sustainable Development Goals, including localizing SDGs. We have heard from President Massa, the level of ambition in terms of our climate finance has now increased to $100 billion by 2030. And to be able to deliver on that, we have a very important role. Operations departments have an even more important role, and that is to be able to identify in some ways those projects that can lead us there. What are some of the important implications? Well, first of all, if we can't measure some of these considerations, such as climate change, if we can't look at how the projects are addressing mitigation adaptation, then we can't effectively manage it. And we do that, but we need to get our DMCs to be better at doing so. We need to take on, in some ways, a more of a holistic approach that allows us to build integrated teams that can help countries in terms of identifying some of those knowledge gaps that may exist, And we need to make sure that we can in some ways guide some of the ministries in terms of those integrated approaches, because they, like us, are often working in silos, right? The whole planning, upstream planning and build up of project pipelines will need to be looked at hand in hand with how we support governments. We have, of course, a very important role in terms of capacity development. That is part of the work that we're doing in terms of a lot of the knowledge services, technical assistance, operations departments are also doing that. We need to help them, for example, to be more ambitious in terms of their national divine contributions and their adaptation plans. For us to be able to build up that pipeline, we need to make sure that their capacity constraints are addressed and they're able to understand many of the challenges that only through a knowledge lens can help them in some ways address and build better infrastructure projects. So I think it's a combination of that work, combination of that feedback loop, and if we do that, ensuring a strong upstream involvement all the way down to the downstream side, I think we should be able to help in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. My next question is for DG PERD. Capacity constraints are limiting the ability to plan for and react to acute and prolonged risk, threatening long-term development efforts. What are ADB plans to improve institutional capacity? DG.
Thank you very much, Hiranya. Okay. ADB has consistently prioritized capacity building. I would say over the years, we certainly have been very consistent with this. Now, there is a need to complement capacity building with new approaches to ensure a continued supply of technical capacity. At this point, we are scaling up capacity building across all forms of assistance. And as appropriate, we are exploring opportunities for something that we call capacity supplementation, the practice of posting experts on a long-term basis. And this is to address skills gaps in critical sectors. Capacity supplementation has the further added benefit of long-term knowledge transfer to people and institutions. That is, experts sitting side by side with national staff. There's that better transfer of knowledge during everyday interactions and in our work. So in this instance, we have an example in the Marshall Islands, for example. We are implementing a long-term capacity supplementation model to support public sector management reform implementation. And here we have consultants who provide on-the-ground support to design and refine and support the implementation of reforms. So the capacity supplementation here translates to longer-term knowledge and skills from having experts and consultants and staff really working side by side every day. And then at the same time, we are preparing tailored and targeted technical training. At the same time, we also are strengthening our understanding of local challenges, particularly of our Pacific small island developing states and our fragile and conflict-affected situations. This is so that we can continue more robust dialogue with local governments and institutions and provide hands-on support for identifying projects, designing projects, implementing projects, monitoring progress, and adjusting project implementation as challenges arise. We are also scaling up our capacity support and implementing targeted regional and country-specific activities. We are also collaborating with development partners, CSOs, and NGOs to scale up capacity in core sectors and to support long-term sustainability. So, for example, we are currently collaborating with the governments of Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, and the World Bank through the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility and the Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative. So these are regional technical assistance facilities whereby we provide support to our various members in the Pacific. And here we also provide both on-demand and also planned technical assistance. We are also building and supporting new regional networks, including the Pacific Water and Wastewater Association. So the combination of capacity building enhanced by strong development partner coordination will provide immediate and long-term support while increasing absorptive capacity. So with that, over to you, Hiranya.
Thank you very much. My next question is for the DG East Asia Department. How can ADB foster greater institutional capacity for infrastructure quality and governance? Over to you, DG.
Okay, let me say that fostering institutional capacity is really about helping executing and implementing agencies build capacity not only in implementing projects, but also strengthening the institutional setups. I would say that based on our experience, and I will again cite an experience that I had in Mongolia, where we were working on border economic zones and looking at how we could strengthen the agencies who are managing the border economic zone. In that instance, what we found was that we were able to foster that by actually supporting them to the establishment of clear regulations, I should say, for operation and maintenance, and so fostering institutional capacity is really helping them to strengthen the institutional frameworks, regulatory frameworks that I think would then foster, I would say, efficient utilization and operation of the assets that are being funded through the ADB project. In the case of the Border Economic Zone project, we also supported them by increasing coordination with other institutions as well, because it's not just about strengthening the institution itself, but also strengthening coordination mechanisms for safe movement of goods and services, for instance, or even for trade facilitation itself. So when I think about fostering institutional capacity, it's not only within, but also looking at how we coordinate. And in that instance, drawing on not only expertise from the institution, but also looking at how PPP could be a model for actually drawing in expertise from the outside to help with certain aspects of governance, be it in the operation of the asset itself, or even in the maintenance of the asset. So let me stop here, Hiranya. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, DG. My next question is for DG CWRD. The question is, in general, how has COVID-19 shifted the momentum for governance reforms in the upper middle income countries?
Hiranya, thank you for this question. I think that's the issue which can take this discussion in a number of different directions. Well, for example, this COVID-19 was very much disruptive of the public sector policy processes in general. And upper middle income countries, at least in our region, have not been an exception. Naturally, this reform preparation and reform discussions in many of our developing countries have been held back, put on hold, as the government policymakers had to do all hands on deck activity to deal with the COVID disruptions, and prompt policy responses have taken center stage. In some member countries, that has been very problematic for the reform processes that were ongoing. Yet in other countries, these reforms actually continued apace despite the COVID. I recently came back from Uzbekistan, for example, and I'm happy to report COVID and no-COVID reforms in this country are continuing, including in infrastructure governance area, PPPs, and the reforms of the infrastructure state-owned enterprises. And we're very happy to continue supporting this. We are now trying to reignite policy dialogue processes and trigger some recovery of the past reform momentums in our DMCs. We have no doubt that our developing member countries continue to recognize the need for governance reforms, but I guess only time will tell if the cost of recent disruption to institutional development and reform plans and priorities will show. I would like to emphasize, though, that probably upper middle income countries might be able to resume this reform momentum a bit faster than some of our other member countries in Central West Asia, in the sense that their specific financial circumstances may help to refocus their policy efforts faster into medium-term reform agendas. In other words, we worry that some of our non-upper middle-income countries might have more protracted and slow economic recoveries, as the COVID-19 crisis will probably will leave deep and medium-term kind of scars on the social protection systems and economies. But on this particular point, only in a few next years will tell what will happen, and we should perhaps remain cautious in assuming that upper middle income countries would recover faster. So in a way that kind of it rings clear that follows recommendation number 9 in this report, which talks about collaborating with development partners. It's probably the best way to ensure how we help our developing member countries, including upper middle countries, to address the needs of the economic recovery, and at the same time remaining focused on resuming governance reform agendas. And on this point, in Central West, we do quite a lot to form strong relationships with other development partners, but surely we can do even better on this particular topic of reform, the infrastructure development and investment governance. This also helps to keep or to improve even investor confidence in our developing member countries, as our own country directors can attest in view of the visits that they receive from various rating agencies and other international observers. Let me stop here, Hiranya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG Zhukov. Now, I have some time for Q&A from the participants. I have 2 questions. One is from Mr. Reddy for Bruno. Can you read this question, Bruno? I should read it out for you.
Please, I don't see it in mine.
Okay.
Oh, it's just, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the 3 aspects, the question is, the 3 aspects, efficiency, accessibility, and sustainability were critical even pre-pandemic. What additional different governance measure systems need to be institutionalized to address these 3 aspects in support of recovery? In this regard, may I request views on the need for different instruments of support and mobilization of funding resources, support for sustainability and harmonizing with other development partners and related governance matters. Basically, the question is that these 3 aspects are important even in the pre-pandemic period. What additional instruments, modalities you would require or you would suggest to achieve these 3 aspects? Thank you, Bruno. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. Yes, indeed, that those 3 aspects were very much part of good project infrastructure investments back then, and it's even more important now, as I mentioned. Now, I think that what we need to do, as I said, is we need to build project selection criteria that is able to avoid the binary situation. Do we look at the more conventional development projects separate from the climate change agenda, or do we integrate both of them? We don't have the resources to or the time to be able to do one and then look at the other. We need to integrate those projects, and that's again the theme that I come back to over and over again, that we need to be better at integrating different sector and thematic approaches into projects. Now, in terms of the specifics, in terms of new instruments, we certainly feel that there is a lot of potential for doing much more such things as policy-based lending for climate change. change. And there is some very good work already started in Southeast Asia that I'm aware of. We need to be able to go back to a lot of more of the work that we used to do in South Asia with financial intermediation lending for renewable energy and that transition. We did quite a bit of work in that in India with IREDA, with the IFCL, but we also, going to your point, we need to be much more effective in terms of harmonizing our work in terms of many of the requirements that we spoke of earlier in terms of the filters. When we do an environmental assessment, we more and more try to harmonize with what other institutions, other development institutions are doing. Eventually, if we can go towards a common template, I think that certainly helps. Certainly with the climate change work in terms of the methodologies for how do we assess climate mitigation, climate adaptation, that is very much part of the parcel that we're working on now, harmonized approaches across the MDBs. Thank you very much.
There is another very important question from Krishna Pathak that I think it's a very important question. Governance work is a political process. The political economy of the country hugely affects the infrastructure projects, quality and value for money. How shall ADB deal the governance issues like corruption, cost and time overdone, weak institutional integrity, etc., etc., with the government, national as well as subnational, parliament and the political process, without addressing these issues at the basically the question is how do you tackle political considerations in improving governance in infrastructure? That is, I think, if I understood correctly, that is the question. How do you address the political ramifications?
That's addressed to whom, Hiran?
Not mentioned, but DG, I leave it to the DG Gutierrez. You want to address that question? Okay, please carry on.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yes, I'd like to try.
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Look, we live in for us in development. There are definitely many factors at play. However, one thing that's always with us is that greater awareness, information sharing, knowledge sharing, and technology actually have a very large role to play. So greater transparency with much more information out there. Of course, we have to process the information. There's a lot of fake information also these days. So for us to be much more aware of what's going on in various sectors, being much more aware of various methodologies, various approaches, and really building the capacity of everyone with respect to different approaches. So let's say even for procurement, for prioritization of projects, even for land acquisition, with greater information, greater awareness, greater capacity building, we will be making progress. And at the same time, technology is very much with us. There's a lot of information technology, and this is also helping increase transparency.
So
Thanks, Hiranya.
Thank you very much. Now, that particular issue, DG Bruno, about this political, how do you handle it? It is very sensitive issue, and because I myself faced this issue while processing many programs. So this is the ideal forum. The DGs know better than anyone else. So how do we handle the political consideration ramification when we, I think DG Ko from East Asia Regional Department wants to say something.
Yes, Hiranjan, just to share from our experience, I think that is when the long-term programmatic approach really works, because when you have a long-term view and you are in a dialogue on an extended basis, that you are not really coming in for a short intervention, that you are really looking at the whole range of assistance that you can provide to support a more integrated and more holistic outcome. And so when you are in that situation, I think what really matters is this prolonged dialogue that we are undertaking when we have programmatic approaches, and that's why the programmatic approach is actually, I would say, very useful, and can drive greater outcomes.
Thank you. DG Carrasco, you want to say something?
Yes, no, thank you very much. I just wanted to, on the political economy and the concerns in terms of anti-corruption, we have the governance assessment and anti-corruption action plan, known as GACAP 2 now effectively. We're coming up with some guidance notes, and that is really about integrating such things as you know, the work on anti-corruption, the work on procurement, and the work on governance assessments that SDCC, OAI, and PPFD work on. And I think that the critical point here is that we need to have that assessment that takes place upstream to then be able to address those shortcomings on the political economy side and on any other of these matters through the course of the implementation of the country program. Doing these assessments, I think, give us an opportunity to have that dialogue, and that I think is an important entry point to be able to address these considerations. Of course, we also have with our NGOC unit and SDCC very good discussions also in terms of NGOC and their involvement in terms of their overall advocacy work. That also is an important contribution to this agenda. Thank you very much.
Yes, there are time will not permit. There are important comments, questions from my old friend Joao in the chat box, but there is also a question from the Pacific Department staff for I think for the DG PERD. The question is how to use differentiated approach to support the three aspects in Pacific. DG PERD, would you like to answer quickly so that I can go back to Joe's issue also?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this question. Okay. For under the Pacific approach and also under the strategy 2030, we speak of differentiated approach, and this actually applies to specific country context. And in the case of the Pacific, we do see that we do see an environment where we have limited capacities. We have the isolation, we have the high cost, etc. Now, in terms of access, for us, when we talk about access, we think not only of we would have to focus not only on what's going on in the urban, in the larger islands where most of the population is concentrated, but we do have to go out also to the outer islands. So we have to keep this all in mind. And at the same time, we also have to think about the different groups that would have to be provided access. When I say different groups, it's from the idea that sometimes we have certain groups that are hard to reach, be it because of a physical or geographical barrier. So we have to think also about approaches of connecting people. So this, and in the case of the Pacific, there's the maritime. There are maritime barriers, and there are also some land or mountainous barriers. So these are things that we have to think about. Next, we have to think about also about how we implement projects. How can we do this differently in all of our projects? Here, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are faced with limited capacity. So we have to think of how we can bring in that capacity while we are actually doing capacity building. So this is where that approach of capacity building can be partnered with capacity supplementation where it is appropriate. So these are some of the things that we have to think about, which are not necessarily the solutions or approaches that other member countries may be thinking of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just quickly, one very important, I think, question for DG Carrasco from Joao. just quickly, emerging markets and developing economies in general are experiencing a wave of debt accumulation that poses a risk to sustainable infrastructure investment. Although this is not a crisis at the current time, what policies responses should our DMC governments adapt to ensure debt fiscal sustainability of infrastructure investment? Bruno, over to you quickly.
Thank you very much, Hiranya. Excellent question, Jean. I would say a few quick points. First of all, we need to make sure that we are monitoring closely the debt sustainability across our countries, make sure that we have a quick, tight, close look at how that is evolving. We need to make sure that our work, whether it's any investment infrastructure project or any public expenditure commitments, is very much inserted into a medium-term fiscal framework that is basically circumscribed by the resource envelope that we have. We need to make sure that obviously what we've discussed, the efficiency side of public investment, the value for money is coming out in those projects in advance. We need to make sure that we're looking at a balanced budget framework and how we look towards a balanced budget or close to balanced budget over the cycle. We need to obviously make sure that what we've discussed in this among the panel members, the need to integrate the recurrent budget for operation maintenance into the overall budget in terms of the investment side, and make sure that we have that very well aligned. And finally, we have to build very much on the Asia Pacific tax hub and help countries strengthen their revenue mobilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time because we need a couple of minutes for a group photo, but very effective sessions, wonderful participation from our all respected DGs and the participants, useful comments, useful questions and comments. I really enjoyed. I hope all participants enjoyed this session. Now over to Ali for a group photo, and thank you again. So I request everyone to switch on your camera for a group photo.
Hiranya, we have already taken the group photo of everyone.
Okay,
so we
that's
are
fine.
okay.
So that's fine. So then with your permission, I'm concluding this again, very effective session and very effective participations from everybody. Thank you very much for participating.
Before everyone leaves the room, may we request participants to please answer our post-event survey. This will be very helpful for us to improve our future sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.